Part 2. Applications. Chapter 4. Domesticated Animals Within Animal Rights Theory. In applying citizenship theory to animals, we begin with the case of domesticated animals. Humans have domesticated a variety of animals to serve a remarkably diverse array of uses, from providing food, clothing, and replacement body parts, for example, heart valves, serving as military and medical research subjects, to performing hard labor, for example, plowing and hauling, or skilled labor, for example, patrol, search and rescue, hunting, guarding, entertainment, therapy, assistance to people with disabilities, and providing companionship. This is a heterogeneous category, and in much of the animal literature, the different types of domesticated animals are discussed separately. The ethics of farm animals is discussed separately from the ethics of keeping pets, or the ethics of animal experimentation. In our view, however, a crucial factor in thinking about the political status of these animals is precisely the fact of domestication itself. Domestication creates a particular sort of relationship between humans and animals. An essential task of any political theory of animal rights is to explore the terms under which that relationship can be rendered just. Throughout much of human history, this relationship has been deeply unjust. Domestication has been characterized by the coercive confinement, manipulation, and exploitation of animals for the benefit of humans. Indeed, this injustice is so deep that for many animal advocates it is irredeemably unjust. A world in which humans continue to maintain domesticated animals cannot be a just world. In this view, the original sin of exploitative domestication is beyond reform. We argue, however, that this is too quick. Relations between humans and domesticated animals can be reordered in a just way if they are reconceived along the lines of membership and citizenship. Where domesticated animals are accorded the status of co-citizens in a political community that governs in the name of both its humans and animal members, justice is possible. Needless to say, when humans first embarked on the process of domesticating animals, they did not intend to include them as members or citizens of their society. In this respect, the domestication of animals is like the importation of slaves from Africa or of indentured laborers from India or China, who were brought into countries solely to provide labor without the expectation of membership and without the right to become citizens. Indeed, it's quite possible that the people who purchased slaves and indentured laborers would not have done so had they realized it would eventually lead to co-citizenship for people they viewed as inferior or unworthy. But whatever the original intent, the only legitimate response today, the only possible basis for reorganizing relationships on a just foundation, is to replace older relations of hierarchy with new relations of co-citizenship and co-membership in a shared community. So too we argue with domesticated animals. In virtue of the causal role that humans have played in bringing these animals into human society, in breeding them to be adapted to human society, and in closing off alternatives, we must accept that domesticated animals are now part of our society. They belong here and must be seen as co-members of a shared human-animal political community. As we will see, reconceptualizing domesticated animals as citizens is not a magic formula for resolving all the ethical dilemmas raised by their presence in a shared political community. It does, however, offer a fresh perspective for thinking about the rights of animals, and we argue that it is more compelling and more fruitful than existing alternatives promoted by animal rights theory to date. Section 1. Defining domestication. To begin with, we need to clarify the term domestication. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, domesticated animals are, quote, created by human labor to meet specific requirements or whims, and are adapted to the conditions of continuous care and solicitude people maintain for them, end quote. There are several logically separable components at work in this definition, and it will be helpful to distinguish these for our discussion. A. The purpose of domestication, that is, the breeding and use of animal bodies to meet specific requirements or whims for humans. B. The process of domestication, that is, the human labor of selective breeding and genetic manipulation to adapt the animal's nature for specific ends. C. The treatment of domesticated animals, that is, the continuous care and solicitude people maintain for them. And D. the state of dependency of domesticated animals on humans for ongoing care. That is, the fact that animals are adapted to the conditions of continuous care. The components are separable in the sense that it is possible to imagine one or more of them existing independently or in various combinations. If humans stopped breeding animals and stopped exploiting them for human use, we would still have a class of animals in existence who are dependent on humans for ongoing care. Or we could imagine humans continuing to breed animals, but doing so with the intent of serving the animal's interests rather than human interests. For example, a breeding program could be designed to eliminate a congenital defect that plagues a particular species or breed of animal, solely with the intent of benefiting the offspring of the animals bred. There could also be instances where animals' interests coincide with human interests, as in the case of eradicating a disease that affects both species. Or one could imagine a breeding program undertaken to protect an animal species from overpopulation and hardship from the resulting scarcity of resources. One could also imagine a breeding program that doesn't result in dependency of the species in question, or even one which results in the greater independence from the need for human management or care, like some existing breeding programs designed to re-establish wild populations of endangered species. Or one could imagine individual animals being treated justly, even when their species generally has been, and continues to be, subject to unjust breeding and treatment, as in the case of a particularly fortunate animal companion. In thinking about the ethics of human-animal relations, we need to distinguish these aspects of domestication. The overwhelming direction of domestication has been to breed specific traits in animals which increase both their dependency on humans and their utility for humans, with no attention to the animal's own interests. But in examining the potential for an ethical relationship between humans and domesticated animals, it is important to distinguish issues of purpose, process, and treatment. Not all forms of controlled reproduction involve instrumentalization or a violation of basic rights, and not all forms of dependency involve abuse or domination. Too much of the existing animal rights theory literature fails to make these distinctions, and so prematurely closes off possible models of just relations with domesticated animals. Section 2. Myths of Humane Treatment and Reciprocity. To date, the animal rights theory literature has been more effective in detailing what is wrong with the existing treatment of domesticated animals than in exploring possible remedies to these wrongs. This is understandable, since one of the major obstacles to effective action on the rights of domesticated animals is the persistence of romanticized myths of their humane treatment. For anyone who takes animal rights seriously, the history of human domestication of animals is a story of ever-intensifying degrees of enslavement, abuse, exploitation, and murder. Intensive farming has reduced animals to widgets, their brief and brutal lives utterly mechanized, standardized, and commodified. Biotechnology goes a step further and alters the very genetic nature of animals in order to make them better widgets. The animal rights movement has worked tirelessly to expose this treatment and the ways in which it is tied to underlying beliefs about the moral insignificance of animals and human entitlement to use them as we see fit. And the rot does not stop at the doors of research labs and factory farms. While recognizing the extreme violations of modern farming, most animal rights theorists have been adamant that there is no such thing as humane meat, even under less industrialized conditions. Animals may have enjoyed a more natural existence under the traditional farming techniques than they do in industrialized farms, but they were exploited and killed nonetheless, and frequently neglected and abused. The scope and intensity of exploitation have increased, but the underlying relationship of domination is the same. There was never a good old days as far as domesticated animals are concerned, and the idea that modern, clean, and efficient methods can contribute to a system of humane slaughter is simply to replace the old myth of happy plantation slaves with the new myth of a brave new world. When these myths of humane treatment are exposed, defenders of animal exploitation often retreat to a different myth, namely that domestication is actually in animals' interests and expresses a form of moral reciprocity. In the case of domesticated animals, we give them life, shelter, food, and care, and in turn they supply us with their meat, skins, and labor. Domesticated animals would not exist if they were not useful to us, and measured against non-existence, a brief life under suitable care ending in a quick death is a reasonable reciprocal arrangement. We would never accept this sort of argument in the human case. Imagine that someone proposed bringing a group of humans into existence in order to exploit and kill them at age 12, or to harvest their organs. This is the realm of horror movies and genocidal crime, not moral theorizing. Children would not exist if their parents did not bring them into existence, and yet this gives parents no right to exploit or otherwise violate the rights of their children. The very fact that such rationalizations are contemplated for farm animals shows how little we value animals, and the extent to which much domestication is premised on the denial of their moral dignity. Similar myths distort the discussion of pets. Many people love their animal companions and care for them reasonably well, and yet the story does not have a happy ending for countless animals. Millions of cats and dogs are killed each year in animal shelters. These include strays, feral animals, animals abandoned by their families. According to a widely cited statistic, families keep their pets on average for only 2 years. And animals considered unadoptable due to age, health, or temperament. Companion animals are often bred at puppy mills by unscrupulous profit seekers. They are sometimes bred to achieve aesthetic ideals which compromise their basic health and mobility. They can be subject to painful and unnecessary procedures, such as tail docking, debarking, and declawing, to make them more attractive or suitable for human companionship, and to training methods using violence and coercion. Their basic needs for food and shelter are often unmet. Even when they live amongst humans who love their companions and have good intentions, sheer ignorance often results in animals' needs for exercise and companionship going unmet. And when disaster strikes, such as war, famine, or floods, companion animals, along with other domesticated animals, are usually abandoned to a terrible fate as humans scramble to save themselves. Section 3. The abolitionist/extinctionist approach to domesticated animals. Animal rights advocates have worked relentlessly to expose the extent of our mistreatment of domesticated animals across a spectrum of traditional and modern practices, practices which put the lie to myths of benign human dominion over domesticated species. However, the question remains, what should we do about these injustices? To oversimplify, the animal rights theory literature offers 2 approaches, which we will call the abolitionist/extinctionist and the threshold views. The former seeks the abolition of relations between humans and domesticated animals, and since domesticated animals can rarely survive on their own, this in effect means the extinction of domesticated species. In this view, we should care for existing domesticated animals, but should employ systematic sterilization to ensure that no more are created. The latter envisages ongoing relations between humans and domesticated animals, subject to various reforms and safeguards designed to ensure mutual benefit and the protection of basic interests. We discuss each view in turn and explain why we think neither is sufficient before going on to elaborate our own citizenship-based alternative in Chapter 5. According to the abolitionist/extinctionist view, the horrendous history of injustice leads to an inescapable conclusion. We must remove ourselves from the equation, whether as owners, overlords, stewards, or ostensible co-contractors. Our power and control inevitably lead to domination and abuse of domesticated animals. We cannot have domestication without mistreatment, because mistreatment is intrinsic to the very concept of domestication. Gary Francione says, quote, "We ought not to bring any more domesticated non-humans into existence. I apply this not only to animals we use for food, experiments, clothing, etc., but also to non-human companions. We should certainly care for those non-humans who we have already brought into existence, but we should stop causing any more to come into existence. It makes no sense to say that we have acted immorally in domesticating non-human animals, but we are now committed to allowing them to continue to breed." End quote. The view that respecting animal rights requires the end of domestication and the eradication of currently existing domesticated species is a hallmark of the abolitionist/extinctionist position. The bottom line is that we must end all human use of and interaction with domesticated animals. To speculate about possible relations of justice between humans and domesticated animals is to fall into the error of welfarist reformism. Defenders of this position invoke a mixture of arguments, including the wrongness of the original act of domestication, the viciousness of current treatment, and the condemnation of the very state of domestic animal dependency. We can see all of these at work in Francione's claim that, quote, domestic animals are dependent on us for when and whether they eat, whether they have water, where and when they relieve themselves, when they sleep, whether they get any exercise, etc. Unlike human children, who, except in unusual cases, will become independent and functioning members of human society, domestic animals are neither part of the non-human world nor fully part of our world. They remain forever in a nether world of vulnerability, dependent upon us for everything that is of relevance to them. We have bred them to be compliant and servile, or to have characteristics that are actually harmful to them, but are pleasing to us. We may make them happy in one sense, but the relationship can never be normal or natural. They do not belong stuck in our world irrespective of how well we treat them. End quote. Note how this position bundles together the different aspects of domestication identified earlier: the intent of domestication, the process of domestication, the fact of dependency, and the actual treatment of domesticated animals. Whether we treat existing animals well, make them happy in one sense, or badly, exploit and kill them, does not change the intrinsic wrongness or unnaturalness of their situation. This intrinsic wrongness contaminates any possibility of us having an ethical relationship with the class of domesticated animals. Francione's position here echoes that of environmentalists such as Calicott, who famously described domesticated animals as debased and unnatural, as living artifacts whom humans have bred to docility, tractability, stupidity, and dependency. Similarly, Paul Shepard refers to pets as human creations, as civilized paraphernalia, vestiges and fragments, and monsters of the order invented by Frankenstein. In our view, the abolitionist/extinctionist call to end all relations with domesticated animals has been a strategic disaster for the animal rights movement. After all, many people have come to their concern for animal rights precisely through their relationship with a companion animal, which has opened their eyes to the rich individuality of animals' lives, and to the possibility of a relationship with animals that is not based on exploitation. To insist that support for animal rights requires condemning all such relationships is to alienate many potential supporters. It has also provided an easy political target for those hostile to animal rights theory, including hunter and breeder organizations, which invoke these extinctionist quotes as a reductio of the very idea of animal rights. Strategy aside, however, we believe that the abolitionist position is simply not intellectually sustainable. It rests on a series of fallacies and misunderstandings about human and animal relationships. Some versions of the abolitionist position rest on a rather crude claim that because it was historically unjust to bring domesticated species into existence, therefore we should seek to take these species out of existence. Consider Francione's claim that, quote, it makes no sense to say that we have acted immorally in domesticating non-human animals, but we are now committing to allowing them to continue to breed, end quote. But this is an obvious fallacy. Consider the case of slaves brought from Africa to the Americas. Justice certainly requires abolishing slavery, but it does not mean abolishing the existence of the former slaves and their offspring. Shipping slaves to America was certainly an injustice, but the remedy is not to seek the extinction of African Americans or to repatriate them to Africa. The original process by which Africans entered America was unjust, but the remedy to that historic injustice is not to turn back the clock to a time when there were no Africans in America. Indeed, far from remedying the original injustice, seeking the extinction or expulsion of African Americans compounds the original injustice by denying their right to membership in the American community and by denying their right to found families and reproduce themselves. Similarly, there is no reason to assume that the remedy to the original injustice of domestication is to extinguish domesticated species. Indeed, we might well think that this abolitionist proposal compounds the original injustice, since it can only be achieved by coercively restricting domesticated animals further, for example, by preventing them from reproducing. The remedy, rather, is to include them as members and citizens of the community. Some abolitionists might respond that the analogy fails on two grounds. A good life was possible for former slaves and their descendants, whereas there is no possibility of a good life for domesticated animals due to their unnatural or degraded condition. And B, preventing the reproduction of former slaves would involve unjust coercion, but there is no comparable injustice in controlling the reproduction of domesticated animals. Both of these claims are suggested in the quotes we listed earlier, but they are rarely defended in depth, and in our view they cannot be sustained. Take first the issue of controlling reproduction. In much of the abolitionist literature, talking about phasing out domesticated animals is remarkably vague, even euphemistic. Consider Francioni's view that we should, quote, certainly care for these non-humans whom we have already brought into existence, but we should stop causing any more to come into existence, end quote. Compare this with Lee Hall's statement that, quote, declining to create more dependent animals is the best decision an animal rights activist can apply, end quote. And John Bryant's view that pets should be, quote, completely phased out of existence, end quote. The language here is very interesting. Stop causing any more to come into existence. Decline to create. Phase out. The descriptions conjure up images of labs in which humans create domesticated animals, as if these animals left to their own devices would not want to reproduce or would have no interest in doing so. Now, it's true that most domesticated animal reproduction is under human control, and that it can be a highly invasive and mechanized process. Assisted insemination is widely practiced. Some breeds of domesticated turkey are unable to reproduce without assistance, as is the use of rape racks, also called more euphemistically mating cradles. In other cases, reproduction is strictly monitored by humans, but not mechanistically allowed. For example, when breeders bring together animals and allow them to mate, if, when, how they choose. The abolitionist position implies that if humans stopped creating domesticated animals, they would cease to exist. But this is not the case. For domesticated animals to be phased out of existence would not just require a cessation of human creation of animals, but a massively increased and probably impossible human effort to forcibly sterilize and or confine all domesticated animals. It would mean not just limiting the procreation of domesticated animals, but preventing it entirely, denying them the opportunity ever to mate and raise a family. It would, in short, involve precisely the sort of coercion and confinement that animal rights theorists say makes domestication unjust, and in that sense compounds rather than remedies the original injustice. In our view, there is a serious question here concerning the infringement of individual liberties which is glossed over by language such as decline to create or phase out of existence. By masking the process of one of human rather than animal agency, the abolitionist position evades important questions about infringements of animals' basic liberties. This isn't to say that it is always wrong to control or limit domesticated animals' fertility. For example, there may be valid paternalistic justifications that appeal to the interests of the animal whose reproduction is being curtailed. It is justifiable to prevent conception in an elderly ewe who will not survive another pregnancy, or to delay opportunities of conception for a young animal who is fertile but too young to bear offspring without compromising her health. As in the case of paternalistic actions undertaken for children or people with intellectual disabilities, such restrictions must meet tests of proportionality and use the least invasive or restrictive means available to meet a justifiable objective serving the individual's interests. In Chapter 5, we defend a more complex task for paternalistic restrictions on domesticated animal fertility as part of a reciprocal citizenship model. So, we do not deny the possibility of justifiable restrictions on domesticated animal reproduction. Our concern is that the abolitionist/extinctionist position supports a massive intervention and makes no attempt to justify it in relation to the individuals on whom liberty is being restricted. But even if we set aside for now the concern about the level of coercion needed to phase out species, a deeper objection to the abolitionist position is its inability to conceive good lives for domesticated animals. It presupposes that domesticated animals will continue to be exploited and that it is impossible for them or their descendants to lead good lives. In our view, this claim is deeply implausible. We all know of companion animals who seem to be leading good lives. And in the case of farm animals, anyone who has visited a farm sanctuary knows that even those animals rescued from factory farms can live out full and happy lives under human care in the company of their own and many other species. Many seem to thrive in the interspecies community of farm life, forming cross-species friendships, creating a kind of farm culture in which the whole is greater than the parts, offering a rich form of existence to a wide variety of individuals, including humans. If it were possible to have this kind of world without the exploitation, wouldn't this be preferable to the extinction of domesticated animals? On what basis, then, can abolitionists claim that domesticated animals cannot have good lives? As we said earlier, this claim is rarely defended in depth, but insofar as it is defended, it seems to rest on deeply problematic assumptions about the relationship between freedom, dignity, and dependency, and the alleged unnaturalness of human-animal interaction. Dependence and dignity. While we agree with abolitionists that human domestication of animals is wrong, it is important to be clear about why this is so. Earlier, we disaggregated the different aspects of domestication, its intent, the actual process, and the resultant state of dependency. We agree with abolitionists that the original intent of animal domestication, to alter animals to serve human ends, is wrong, just as it would be wrong to engage in selective breeding of a human subclass in order to serve other humans. Moreover, we agree that the process of domestication, confinement and forced breeding, involves a violation of the basic rights of liberty and bodily integrity. Any attempt to re-establish relations with domesticated animals on the basis of justice will need to change both the characteristic ends and means of human control over domesticated animals. Our citizenship model, described in Chapter 5, aims to address just these sorts of changes. However, abolitionists go further and argue that the resultant state of dependency is also inherently wrong in a way that cannot be reformed or redeemed. It is now part of the very nature of these animals to be dependent, as a result of decades, centuries, or millennia of breeding, and for many abolitionists, this inbred dependency condemns domesticated animals to lives without integrity and dignity. Let's return to the quote from Francione cited earlier. Quote, "Domestic animals are dependent on us for when and whether they eat, whether they have water, where and when they relieve themselves, when they sleep, whether they get any exercise, etc. Unlike human children, who, except in unusual cases, will become independent and functioning members of human society, domestic animals are neither part of the non-human world nor fully part of our world. They remain forever in the nether world of vulnerability, dependent on us for everything that is of relevance to them. We have bred them to be compliant and servile, or to have characteristics that are actually harmful to them, but are pleasing to us. We may make them happy in one sense, but the relationship can never be natural or normal. They do not belong stuck in our world, irrespective of how well we treat them." End quote. Here we see a condemnation of the very nature of domesticated animals. They are unnatural, dependent upon us for everything, compliant and servile, compared to children who will never grow up and become fully functioning, and so on. Similarly, Hall justifies extinction of domesticated animals because, quote, "it's disrespectful to afford them an autonomy that's incomplete and not in their best interest," end quote. The alleged unnaturalness of domesticated animals has two dimensions. In terms of their physical and mental characteristics, selective breeding has resulted in neotenization, the retention of juvenile characteristics in an adult of the species, such as cute features, low aggression, playfulness, and other characteristics. Dogs more closely resemble juvenile wolves than adult wolves in size, head shape, eagerness to learn and play, retention of begging, and barking behaviors. Concerning their ability to function in the world, domesticated animals have been bred for dependency, They are dependent upon us for everything that is of relevance to them, much like human children. Only in the case of domesticated animals, they are forever stuck in this nether world of vulnerability. These two characteristics, neotenization and dependency, are seen by abolitionists as locking domesticated animals into an undignified state of perpetual immaturity. In our view, this entire way of understanding domesticated animals is misguided and indeed morally perverse. There is nothing inherently undignified or unnatural about either neoteny or dependency, and to condemn domesticated animals on these bases is not only unjustified, but would have pernicious consequences for humans as well. Consider first the issue of dependency. It is puzzling that animal rights theorists continue to use unproblematized notions of independence or autonomy and dependence at precisely the same time when philosophy and political theory more generally are increasingly attentive to the many fallacies and distortions involved in this sort of binary opposition. Traditionally, human political theory, like abolitionist animal rights theory, took the state of independence to be the natural and highest goal of human life. Decades of feminist critique have demonstrated how this view is the product of male bias and the socially constructed division of public and private spheres. It is increasingly recognized that humans, at all stages of life, are vulnerable and dependent beings. Our sense of independence and self-sufficiency rests on a fragile foundation. This fragility becomes all too apparent when we are confronted by natural or human-caused disaster, when we lose loved ones, our livelihoods, or our homes, when we experience serious injury or illness, or when we become responsible for dependence. There are important questions of degree, and some humans, for example, people with physical or mental disabilities, experience significant levels of dependency throughout their lives. But even in the cases of humans who are acutely vulnerable and dependent, such as those with severe mental disabilities, we have come to recognize the indignity involved in perceiving them strictly in terms of their dependency or alleged lack of functioning. Disability advocates have continuously demonstrated how this perspective blinds us to the ways in which different enabling conditions allow individuals with disabilities to exercise significant kinds of agency and independence. Similar arguments have been made in feminist literature and on writings about children. Dependence in this richer view is not the binary opposite of independence. Rather, recognizing our inevitable interdependence is a precondition to supporting people's ability to express preferences, develop capacities, and make choices. Dependency doesn't intrinsically involve a loss of dignity, but the way in which we respond to dependency certainly does. If we despise dependency as a kind of weakness, then when a dog paws at his dinner bowl or nudges us winningly to remind us that it is walk time, we will see ingratiation or servility. However, if we don't view dependency as intrinsically undignified, we will see the dog as a capable individual who knows what he wants and how to communicate in order to get it, as someone who has the potential for agency, preferences, and choice. When we view others as servile dependents, we don't have to consider them as particular individuals with unique perspectives, needs, desires, and abilities that can be nurtured. If we look beyond their dependency, however, we can learn how to understand and respond to their wishes, demands, and contributions. We can ask how best to restructure society to enable their potential functioning. The idea that natural and normal relations do not contain dependency is a strange one. Domesticated animals are made very vulnerable by their dependency on humans for food, shelter, and companionship. But non-domesticated animals are also acutely vulnerable to weather conditions, food sources, and predators. Some wild animals are relatively mobile, adaptable, and social, with a wide scope of independent agency for meeting their food, shelter, and companionship needs, for avoiding hazards, or generally enjoying life. Others are acutely vulnerable to limited mobility or ecological niche specialization, rendering them utterly dependent on a single food source or climate phenomenon. We humans become acutely aware of our own dependency when the internet crashes, the power grid fails, or the just-in-time food delivery system is disrupted. Dependency, though highly variable, is an inescapable fact of life for us all. Indignity does not arise from this fact. Indignity arises when our needs are belittled, exploited, and or unmet by those who should know better. And indignity arises when the fact of dependency is used to occlude or stifle opportunities for agency. There is no question that domesticated animals are subject to appalling indignities, in addition to the direct violation of their basic rights. However, it is a mistake to equate this indignity with their state of dependency on humans per se. The indignity arises in our response to that dependency, both in the way we fail to meet needs when others are truly dependent on us, and also the way we fail to recognize the many ways in which domesticated animals are individuals capable of developing considerable scope for independent agency. Is neoteny unnatural? Domestication and neotenization go hand in hand. When you select for a single juvenile trait, such as low aggression or tame ability, other juvenile traits follow, such as floppy ears, flatter snouts, playfulness, and so on. Over time, the adults of the domesticated species come to exhibit traits that formerly were limited to juveniles amongst their ancestors. Abolitionists seem to view this process unnatural and as demeaning. But is it really? On the contrary, neotenization is a perfectly natural form of evolution. If juvenile traits are the most adaptive in a particular environment, then they will be selected for. Juvenile traits include willingness to explore, ability to learn, and a weakened sense of species boundaries in social interaction. One can see that under a variety of environmental situations, these would be extremely adaptive traits to maintain into adulthood. For example, Stephen Bundiansky argues that the climate fluctuations of the last ice age favored adaptive animals over niche specialists, and selection for juvenile traits, for example, the willingness to explore new territories in search of food, the ability to learn to adapt to changing circumstances, and willingness to cooperate across species boundaries, allowed some species to survive while others perished. Many animals underwent a process of self-domestication during this period of climate and environmental upheaval. Indeed, Budiansky and others have argued that dogs and other domesticated species underwent prolonged periods of self-domestication long before humans began actively breeding for selected traits. Another example of self-domesticating species is bonobos. If you compare bonobos to chimps, you see a very similar relationship as between dogs and wolves. Bonobos are neotenized chimps, displaying physical traits such as reduced head size and smaller teeth, jaw, and brain, and social traits such as reduced aggression, increased desire to play and learn, increased sociality and cooperation, and increased sexual interest and availability. A very similar relationship obtains between domesticated dogs and wolves. And here's the kicker. Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Wrangham, and others have argued that humans have also self-domesticated. Substitute humans for bonobos in the above example, and you see that humans also display traits of neotenized chimps, and that includes brain size, which has decreased by about 10% in humans over the last 30,000 years, during the same period that body, head, jaw, and tooth size have declined. This process of self-domestication has been critical to human development and our ability to live and cooperate as part of an ever larger species. When we look at human development, we see the evolution of a more glacial form: reduced aggression, increased ability to play, learn, and adapt, and increased social bonding and cooperative behavior as positive developments. These attributes are positively valued in humans, yet these same attributes in domesticated animals lead to accusations that they have been bred to be stupid, have a smaller brain size, infantile, compliant, and servile. Apparently, neotenization is compatible with dignity in the human case, but renders domesticated animals undignified. As in the case of dependency, we would argue that this alleged indignity is in the eye of the beholder, not the intrinsic nature of the domesticated animal. As Burgess Jackson says, quote, "If dogs and cats are to be viewed as unauthentic or infantile versions of their wild cousins, then for the sake of consistency, human beings should be viewed as unauthentic or infantile versions of the primates from which they descended and to whom they are presently related." Abolitionists are right to condemn the confinement and forced/selective breeding of domesticated animals, especially the purposive selection of traits that harm animals while making them more useful to humans. Where we part company with the abolitionist position is in its condemnation of dependency and neotenization per se. Domesticated animals are not intrinsically degraded by these aspects of their evolution, such that they have no opportunity for a good life or no interest in reproduction. And so the remedy for the historic and ongoing injustice to domesticated animals is not to seek their extinction, but to reconstruct our relationship on the grounds of justice. The inevitability of relationship and symbiosis. The abolitionist assumption that animal dependency on humans is unnatural is related to another core abolitionist assumption, namely, that it is unnatural for animals to be interacting with humans in the first place. In the passage cited earlier, Francione implies that it is unnatural for domesticated animals to be stuck in our world. Similarly, Dunayer equates domestication with forced participation of animals in human society. The implication is that animals, left to their own devices and free of human interference, would live in their own world separate from humans. Living in human society is an unnatural state of affairs for them, one resulting from misguided human interventions and leading to unnatural dependency. Here again, this is a misunderstanding of the relationships at work. As we discuss more in Chapter 7, it is quite natural for many animals to seek out human society and the opportunities it offers. Adaptive opportunists like raccoons, mallard ducks, rats, squirrels, and countless others thrive in human settlements and persist in urban living even in the face of aggressive human efforts to discourage them. Humans are not hermetically sealed from the surrounding environment, but are a part of it. A human-altered landscape is just as much an ecosystem as an undisturbed wild one. Nature abhors a vacuum, and as our patterns of settlement and activity alter the environment, other species will inevitably adapt to fill available ecological niches. So there always have been and always will be animals who adapt to live in symbiosis with human activity, drawn to the opportunities offered by our forms of shelter, waste disposal, agricultural, and resource practices. Histories of domestication suggest that the ancestors of today's dogs, cats, and domesticated herbivores were the adaptive opportunists of their day. Dogs' wolf-like ancestors were drawn to human settlement for food scraps, warmth, and shelter. The advent of agriculture and large-scale grain storage attracted rodents to human settlement, which in turn attracted cats and other predators of rodents. Herbivores, like deer today, were attracted to human settlement by feeding opportunities and the protection afforded from some of their human-wary predators. Prior to active domestication by humans, symbiotic relationships developed between humans and many species of animal. These relationships initially resulted just as much, if not more, from animal agency and adaptation as they did from human agency or intervention. Then, over time, humans learned how to manipulate the breeding of opportunistic animals in order to select for attributes useful to humans, thereby altering the animal's evolutionary trajectory. However, if humans were never clued into selective breeding, we would not currently be living in a world with a neat separation of human and other animals. Humans in cities, wild animals out in the wilds. Rather, we would be sharing our communities as we do now with countless adaptive species. This suggests that we cannot escape the ethical complexities of human-animal relationships simply by bringing an end to domestication. Animals are part of our daily lives whether or not we invite or force them into our world. There is no such thing as our world that doesn't include animals, and our task is to identify appropriate forms of human-animal relations. An interesting example here concerns the Sami relationship with reindeer in northern Scandinavia. Reindeer are considered only semi-domesticated. They exist in free-roaming herds, and their breeding is not manipulated. However, over time, they have adapted to the presence of humans and some forms of husbandry. Humans manage the herds, and they kill reindeer for meat, skins, and antlers, and sometimes they milk the animals. The animals are not confined. They could run away from the humans if they wanted. This sort of case raises important issues that cannot be addressed or even identified within an abolitionist framework. Our point is not, as some non-animal rights theorists claim, that the human use of animals should be seen as non-exploitative whenever animals have chosen domestication or semi-domestication in this instance. we have already rejected that view. The fact that opportunistic animals gravitate to human community does not give us license to exploit them, just as in the human case, the fact that desperate refugees would sell themselves into slavery does not make slavery legitimate. Indeed, our point is just the opposite. Even when relations between humans and animals arise through symbiosis rather than forced participation, there are still important moral questions to be asked about the fair terms of interaction. We need to determine which ways of interacting with adaptive animals or semi-domesticated animals are permissible, since they will interact with us whether we like it or not. Such relationships are inevitable, and because of superior human power, they carry the endemic risk of turning into relations of exploitation. A central task of any theory of animal rights is to identify the terms under which these relations are non-exploitative. We need a basis for distinguishing parasitic and exploitative relationships from mutually beneficial ones. We need to know the boundaries of acceptable use of animals by humans and our duties to animals who adapt to our presence, whether invited or not. And once we have identified the principles of non-exploitative relations, there is no reason for ruling out of court the possibility that relations with domesticated animals can also be reconstructed along just terms. The abolitionist framework ignores these issues and preempts important moral possibilities by assuming that it is only forced participation that brings humans and animals together. In short, we believe that the abolitionist approach is multiply flawed. It wrongly treats states of dependency as inherently undignified, and wrongly treats human-animal interaction as somehow unnatural. Once we set aside these misconceptions, there is no reason to assume that domesticated animals are stuck in a condition of intrinsic and unalterable justice that can only be remedied through their extinction, a goal which itself could only be achieved through further unjust exercises of coercion and confinement. We hasten to add that we are not in any way trying to deny or diminish the gravity of the original injustice done in domesticating animals. Domestication involves wrongs on several levels: infringing basic liberties through forced confinement and breeding animals in ways that compromise their health and lifespan, and that thwart their potential to return to the wild, and more generally turning them into a means to human ends, rather than respecting them as ends in themselves. We fully share the abolitionist view that these harms to domesticated animals are at the heart of the human oppression of animals. It is domesticated animals that suffer the full horrors of human oppression, even if public opinion seems to care more about, say, seal hunting or endangered species. Confronted with this historic record of unending misery, it is understandable that abolitionists want to bring the entire existence of domesticated animals to an end. For abolitionists, the remedy is to turn back the clock to a time before domesticated animals existed in order to undo the historic wrongs. In Francione's words, quote, "It makes no sense to say that we have acted immorally in domesticating non-human animals, but we are now committed to allowing them to breed," end quote. But this is the wrong remedy. Indeed, it is a perverse remedy, compounding the original justice. Here again, it's instructive to think about debates on ending slavery in the USA in the early 19th century. When abolitionism was first seriously debated, many whites held the view that justice required turning back the clock, as it were. Blacks were wronged when Europeans captured them, transported them to the Americas, and enslaved them. To right this wrong, the only solution was to transport them back to Africa and restart the clock of history. But of course, this was neither the only nor the just solution. It was an attempt to evade the forward-looking demands of justice. African Americans were forcibly incorporated into white society as slaves and then as second-class citizens. Over time, the experience of slavery changed them. It changed their cultures, their physical being, their sense of identity, their aspirations, and their options. With the end of slavery, the path of justice was not to transport African Americans back to a historical trajectory that no longer existed for them. It was to move forward in recognizing them as full and equal citizens. We face a similar moral challenge with domesticated animals. To be sure, this will require radical changes in the way we treat domesticated animals, including the underlying purposes, serving human interests, the means, forced confinement and breeding, and the standard forms of treatment, exploiting and killing for food, experimentation, and labor. But as we will see, such changes are possible. Section 4. Threshold Approaches. Not all animal rights theorists endorse the abolitionist/extinctionist position. Some defend what we are calling a threshold position, which allows for the possibility that human relations with domesticated animals could be drastically altered in order to meet the demands of justice. The threshold approach does not seek the phasing out of the existence of domesticated animals, but rather seeks a mutually beneficial symbiosis between humans and domesticated animals. In this view, the goal is to define certain thresholds for allowable uses of domesticated animals while prohibiting their exploitation or sacrifice. Stephen Saponsis, for example, argues that liberating domesticated animals does not rule out all human uses of them. Quote, "Rather, the goal is to provide for animals the same sort of protection against the routine sacrifice of their interests currently enjoyed only by humans. Just as it is ordinarily in our best interest not to be hermits, but to be of benefit to others in certain ways, so it may well be in the best interest of animals to be of benefit to us in certain ways. Just which uses of animals are mutually beneficial is, of course, the controversial issue." End quote. Saponsis himself does not develop a theory of mutually beneficial relations between humans and domesticated animals. He defers this question, quote, "for a much better world than ours," end quote, after gross forms of exploitation have been ended. This, indeed, is rather typical of the non-abolitionist animal rights theory literature. Theorists acknowledge the need for some theory of mutually beneficial relations, but then leave it for some future occasion. However, a couple of important attempts have been made to specify principles for regulating our relations with domesticated animals. In this section, we discuss the ideas of David de Grazia, Tsachi Zamir, and Martha Nussbaum. Each account offers valuable insights, but also suffers from serious limitations. In particular, we argue that they mischaracterize the nature of the community of justice. In our view, the result of domestication is that animals are now appropriately seen as members of society, where membership entails rights of residency. This is their home, they belong here. The right to have their interests counted when determining the collective or public good of the community, and the right to shape evolving rules of interaction. In the human case, this fact of social membership is captured in the idea of citizenship, and we argue that this is the appropriate framework for thinking about domesticated animals as well. As we will see, existing animal rights theory accounts of the appropriate threshold of animal use do not acknowledge the significance of these facts of membership, and so end up legitimating forms of injustice. De Grazia and Zamir on use and exploitation. The threshold view presupposes that we can distinguish permissible use of domesticated animals from impermissible exploitation or oppression. The idea of using animals may seem inherently committed to viewing animals in unacceptably instrumental terms, simply as a means to our own ends. But this is a mistake. We regularly and permissibly use other people, our family, friends, acquaintances, and strangers, in order to achieve our own ends. Most relationships have instrumental aspects which are unproblematic, as long as we don't view others' very existence in a totalizing instrumental fashion. This use is part of the give and take of society, and only tips over into exploitation under certain conditions. Indeed, in the human context, we don't simply use people who happen to be available, we actually bring new people into the community, at least in part, in order to make use of them. For example, parents often have multiple motives in deciding to have children. They may simply wish to bequeath the gift of life onto another, but having children also serves their own ends. The desire to be a parent, a desire for companionship, the hope of an heir to carry on a family tradition or business, and so on. Consider also the case of immigration policy. Countries routinely favor immigration applicants of a particular age or possessing particular skills depending on the labor needs of the host country. We bring individuals into the community on the expectation of using them to benefit particular industries or society more generally. Precisely because others have an interest in using them, both children and immigrants are vulnerable to exploitation. But the solution is not to eliminate reproduction or immigration, or to eliminate the ways in which children and immigrants help us to achieve our aims. Rather, justice requires defining a set of criteria and safeguards to ensure that the use is mutually beneficial, that it is indeed part of a give and take of social life amongst members of a shared community, rather than the one-sided exploitation of the weaker by the stronger. There is no reason in principle why a comparable distinction cannot be made in the case of domesticated animals, allowing us to distinguish permissible uses of animals from impermissible exploitation. Perhaps domesticated animals can be used for companionship, or for certain forms of labor, for example protecting sheep, or for certain products, for example manure, while ruling out exploitation that is substantially detrimental to the freedom and well-being of animals, for example long work hours, unsafe conditions, and lack of options. But how should we draw this distinction in the case of domesticated animals? In human case, as we have indicated, we answer this question in light of an ideal of membership. Use involves the give and take of social life amongst members of a shared community. Exploitation involves treating people in ways that presuppose or result in their relegation to the status of second-class citizens, as slaves or lower caste members. Preventing exploitation, therefore, involves a set of criteria and safeguards intended to affirm the ideas of membership and citizenship, and to ensure that use remains confined within the mutual give and take of social life amongst members. This is not, however, the framework used by existing threshold accounts of the rights of domesticated animals. Instead, theorists like de Grazia and Zamir offer a much weaker set of criteria and safeguards, criteria that we believe reproduce relations of subordination and exploitation. Both de Grazia and Zamir accept that humans have acquired special duties towards animals as a result of domestication, duties that prohibit exploitation of animals. However, in each case they define exploitation not by reference to some ideal of the give and take of membership in a shared community, but rather by reference to two criteria. A, some, quote, floor of well-being, end quote, that ensures the animals' lives are worth living and their most basic needs are met, and B, some counterfactual of what would have happened in the absence of human action, that is, that animals are not worse off than they would have been in the absence of human care and control. It is this second criterion that interests and worries us. The two theorists define this counterfactual in different ways. For de Grazia, the criterion involves comparison with life in the wild. If an animal would be better off living in the wild, then we harm it by keeping it as a pet, or on a farm or zoo. But so long as our treatment of animals does not leave them worse off than they would be in the wild, then our use is permissible. As de Grazia acknowledges, this is a very weak requirement, at least in relation to domesticated animals. It may set a very strong presumption against capturing wild animals for display in zoos. Such animals are almost always better off left alone in the wild. In the case of domesticated animals, however, many animals would not survive, let alone thrive in the wild. After all, they have been bred for centuries to be dependent on humans. Even if one treated a dog simply as a beast of burden to be used and used up in difficult labor without the opportunity for play and companionship, it might still live longer than if simply turned onto the street and left to fend for itself. For Zamir, the relevant contrast is with non-existence. In the case of domesticated animals, their very existence depends on whether humans bring them into being, and so the question for Zamir is whether animals have an interest in being brought into existence for use by humans. He argues that, in general, animals do benefit from having a chance to live, provided that the forms of human use do not subject animals to levels of suffering or harm that make their lives not worth living. In Zamir's view, many uses of domesticated animals will pass this threshold, for example, no-kill milk and egg farming, pet ownership, and animal-assisted therapy using dogs and horses. He acknowledges that these activities involve harms to animals, but not enough to make their lives qualitatively bad. Harms can be justified if they are reasonable prerequisites for humans to be willing to bring these animals into being. For example, humans won't have domestic chickens unless they can raise them in large enough flocks to have an economically viable egg operation. This might mean that painful debeaking is necessary, but it is worth it for the chickens in exchange for existence. Unless calves are removed from cows, they will drink the lion's share of the cow's milk, which might make a dairy operation unviable. Zamir says that if we believe that removing calves from cows is more of a temporary distress than a long-term harm, then separation may be acceptable, being worth it for the cows in exchange for existence. In other words, he allows for various violations of rights, separation of families, non-consensual surgical procedures, coercive training, in exchange for the opportunity to live. Zamir rules out extreme violations, for example, killing animals or subjecting them to ongoing suffering, but allows for less serious violations because they are, allegedly, in the animal's interest overall, as compared with the counterfactual of non existence. There are important differences between de Grazia's and Zamir's versions of the counterfactual, but it should be immediately clear how weak both are, and how far they depart from the way we think about use and exploitation in the human case. Consider some analogies. As noted above, we often bring new members into our society for instrumental reasons. We bring children or immigrants into society in part because of expectations of their use to us. However, once a child is born, or an immigrant settles permanently, they become co-members of the society, whose use must be regulated by norms of citizenship. We don't allow parents to violate the rights of their children on the grounds that they wouldn't have given them life otherwise. Imagine someone who justifies removing a child's vocal cords on the grounds that she would never have become a parent in the first place if she had known she would have had to listen to a child's crying or screaming, and that even without vocal cords, a child's life is still worth living. In the human case, we don't accept that the value of existence to the child justifies such harms. Or imagine that a couple with two biological children decides to adopt a third child from a foster home in which the child is neglected. The couple meets the basic needs of the adopted child such that his life is worth living and he is better off than he would have been in the foster home. However, when it comes to funding music lessons, sports activities, or university education, the parents only support their biological children while using their adopted child as a household servant. Or consider a rich country with an active immigration program that brings in workers from poor countries, primarily to perform jobs that the rich country's native-born population avoids, and allows them to settle permanently. The rich country ensures that the immigrants are paid enough to meet their basic needs, but it denies them access to legal protections regarding overtime and vacation policies, employment insurance, workplace training opportunities, pensions, etc. The workers are better off than they would be back in their poor country and can meet their basic needs. However, they are second-class citizens, not entitled to share in the host society's wealth and opportunities, no matter how long they live there or how much they contribute. In both of these cases, we should surely condemn the treatment of the adopted child or the immigrants as unjust. In these examples, our sense of justice within the family and larger community is governed by something more than the fulfillment of de Grazia's and Zamir's thresholds. It is governed by a conception of membership. Justice is not measured against the counterfactual of non-existence, or the counterfactual of banishment or exile or return to some prior state outside the community. It is measured in terms of an egalitarian vision of the social community, and when we bring new people into the community, via birth or immigration, we must allow them to become full members and not condemn them to permanent second-class status. Why should the standard be different for animals whom we bring into our community? What justifies treating humans as members first class, encompassed within an egalitarian conception, and animals as members second class, entitled to the lesser threshold of basic needs and the two counterfactual requirements? Far from contesting the exploitation of animals, these approaches legitimize and institutionalize their subordinate status. In our view, what both versions of the counterfactual ignore is that humans have already brought domesticated animals into a mixed society. This has to be the starting point of any credible account of the rights of domesticated animals. They are already here, living amongst us, the product of a long history of interaction and interdependence. Both de Grazia and Zamir write as if humans could simply walk away from domesticated animals, and that if we do decide to continue interacting with them, our only obligation is not to make them worse off than they would be if we did walk away. This is a bizarre view to take, ignoring the fact that human societies, collectively speaking, have acquired special duties to domesticated animals, stemming from centuries of captivity and breeding. Our actions over generations have foreclosed for many domesticated animals the possibility of a life in the wild. We cannot evade this responsibility by choosing as individuals not to adopt an animal companion or not to keep chickens in our yard. It is a collective responsibility stemming from the cumulative impact of our treatment of domesticated animals. A comparison with human immigration is again instructive. When newcomers enter a community, there are often specific individuals with special responsibilities to help them. For example, sponsoring family members or church groups. However, the members of society have a collective responsibility towards newcomers, a duty to help them integrate and become successful members of society. This collective responsibility is usually discharged via government programs of language training, citizenship education, settlement supports, job training, and so on. Similarly, duties toward children are conceived in both private terms, the duties of parents to their children, and public terms, the duties of society to nurture development and socialization through the provision of education, healthcare, etc. De Grazia and Zamir miss this socio-political dimension. Domesticated animals are part of a shared community with us, a mixed community which has existed over time, generating collective and intergenerational obligations. As a result, we not only have an obligation as individuals not to make others worse off through our personal actions, but also a collective responsibility arising from domestication to create fair terms of membership. These problems with existing threshold models may help to explain why many animal rights theorists endorse the abolitionist/extinctionist approach. Given that domestication is driven by human purposes, and given the enormous incentives to exploit animals, there is an omnipresent danger that threshold models will simply become a pretext for ongoing exploitation, and that assessments of harm will be biased by human self-interest. Consider Zamir's speculation that the separation of calves is only a temporary distress to them and their mothers, or that breaking horses is not a serious harm. The various thresholds that have been proposed may simply become another version of the sort of welfarist reforms that we've already seen are inadequate in addressing animal exploitation. Neither welfarist reforms aimed at the reduction of unnecessary suffering, nor threshold accounts aimed at reducing exploitation can effectively block the human domination of domesticated animals. Only the complete abolition/extinction of domesticated animals can end injustice. We take this objection seriously. However, as we have seen, the abolitionist approach is, in its own way, an abdication of our responsibility to domesticated animals, and perhaps even a compounding of that original justice. In our view, neither threshold nor abolitionist views take sufficiently seriously our ongoing obligations to domesticated animals. Both, in their own ways, provide a license for humans to evade these responsibilities. The citizenship model we develop in Chapter 5 offers a fundamentally different approach. Section 5. Nussbaum and the Species Norm Principle. Before elaborating our own citizenship model, we'd like to briefly consider one other approach, developed by Martha Nussbaum in her Frontiers of Justice. Unlike Zamir and de Grazia, Nussbaum seeks to apply the same general framework of justice to animals as to humans. Our obligation in both cases is to enable individuals to achieve as far as possible their capabilities. Our obligations to animals are not constrained by some artificial counterfactual of non-existence or life in the wild. Rather, as humans, we have an open-ended obligation to promote flourishing through the enabling of capabilities. Pitched at this very abstract level, we are sympathetic to Nussbaum's capability approach. However, we believe that, like de Grazia and Zamir, she elaborates her approach in ways that ignore the fact that humans and domesticated animals already form mixed societies, and as a result, she misses the implications of this shared socio-political context for animal justice. The problem, in brief, lies with the way Nussbaum ties her capability theory of justice to what she calls the species norm. According to Nussbaum, individuals thrive in ways typical for members of their species. Therefore, justice requires that we enable individuals to achieve, insofar as possible, the capabilities as defined for typical members of their species. The question on her approach is not what does this individual require in order to flourish, but what do individuals of this type, i.e. species, typically require in order to flourish. Nussbaum uses the idea of species norm to ensure that even for those individuals who don't possess the normal capabilities for their species, severely disabled humans, for example, the target of social policy should be to ensure that they achieve the species-defined capabilities as far as possible. In order to flourish, humans need to learn a human language and be socialized to human society so that they can enjoy contact and relationships with other humans. It is a matter of justice that human individuals be able to achieve these capabilities. In the case of humans with severe mental disabilities, it may not be possible to achieve the full capability, but it is a duty of justice that we devote the necessary time and resources to help them achieve this capability insofar as they are able, providing them with a life as normal as can be achieved. Quote, we should bear in mind that any child born into a species has the dignity relevant to that species, whether or not it seems to have the basic capabilities relevant to that species. For that reason, it should also have all the capabilities relevant to the species, either individually or through guardianship. End quote. Applied to animals, this means that justice for animals requires access to the capabilities that are typical of members of their particular species. Quote, in short, the species norm, duly evaluated, tells us what the appropriate benchmark is for judging whether a given creature has decent opportunities for flourishing. The same thing goes for non-human animals. In each case, what is wanted is a species-specific account of central capabilities, and then a commitment to bring members of that species up to that norm, even if special obstacles lie in the way of that. End quote. For Nussbaum, species membership sets not only a baseline for justice, but also an outer limit. She says, for example, quote, for chimpanzees, language use is a frill, constructed by human scientists. Their own characteristic mode of flourishing in their own community does not rely on it. End quote. Sign language, or computer-assisted language, for chimpanzees is a frill, because normal chimpanzees don't sign or share a language with humans. By contrast, normal dogs are mobile, so if your dog companion is injured, Nussbaum argues that it is appropriate to provide a prosthetic device if that will allow the dog to regain normal mobility. In the case of injury or disability, as in more general circumstances, the species norm is the appropriate guide for whether or not a particular intervention is appropriate. In our view, this preoccupation with species norm might make sense in a world where humans and animals lived separately. Chimpanzees would flourish according to their species norm, quote, in their own community, unquote, in the wild, while humans would flourish according to their species norm in their own community. But the challenge of domesticated animals is precisely that we already live in a society that contains both animals and humans who must find a way to live together on terms of justice. And this means that we need a theory of capabilities that is premised on enabling humans and domesticated animals to flourish in mixed communities, rather than enabling each species to flourish separately in their own community. For chimpanzees living in the wild, a concept of flourishing tied to a species norm is probably a reasonable standard. Species membership is a useful shorthand classification for making a rough and ready assessment of the likely needs and capabilities of any particular individual. But in the case of domesticated animals, our positive duties towards them cannot be fully captured by a conception of the species norm. They are members of a species, but they are also members of an interspecies community. The relevant capabilities for any particular animal will be greatly affected by this context. Wolves or feral dogs may need to communicate primarily with other wolves or feral dogs, but companion dogs need to communicate with humans and other species with whom they live, and to function in a mixed human-animal society. For a dog or donkey at a rural farm sanctuary, relevant capabilities might relate to getting along with the variety of other animals of varied species, education about the hazards of farm machinery, or the learning of useful skills, like protecting sheep or shooing crows away from the corn crib. For a city dog, learning to take the subway, or to activate accessible door devices, or learning the niceties of where to defecate, may all be relevant capabilities. In other words, these capabilities relevant to flourishing are defined by social context as much as species membership. We have made domesticated animals part of human society, and we have a duty to ensure that they can flourish in that interspecies context, which will involve capabilities not relevant to their feral or wild cousins. Moreover, this need for an interspecies account of capabilities goes in both directions. Our conception of human flourishing must also take into account the fact that humans live in mixed communities, and that interacting justly with other species is both a responsibility and an opportunity. Our conception of human flourishing shouldn't assume that our most significant relationships must be with other humans, as opposed to individuals of other species. For many humans, this is simply not the case, and it's not clear why this should be conceptualized as a failure to achieve a species norm, rather than simply an individual proclivity or choice. Consider Nussbaum's discussion of Arthur, her nephew, who is diagnosed as having forms of Asperger's and Tourette's syndromes. His intellectual capabilities are formidable, but he is enormously challenged in terms of social relations with humans. Nussbaum says, quote, Arthur will flourish, if he does, as a human being, and that fact means that special efforts must be made to develop his social capacities. It is clear that without such efforts he will not form friendships, wider social relationships, or useful political relationships. Such a lack matters for Arthur, because the human community is his community. He has no option to go off and search somewhere in the universe for a community of intelligent aliens with minimal social capacity, such as Mr. Spock. Humans expect certain things of him, and so education must nourish those capacities, even if it is very expensive to devise such forms of education. The relevance of the species norm is that it defines the context, the political and social community in which people either flourish or do not. End quote. While this position helps to underpin a powerful set of entitlements for people with disabilities, it is too rigid and potentially cruel in its blindness to individual capacities and interests. Rather than spending countless hours trying to learn the niceties of human social interaction with very limited success, someone with severe autism spectrum disorder, for example, might derive greater happiness and satisfaction from interacting with dogs, or horses, or flocks of chickens, with whom he or she is able to communicate more intuitively and rewardingly. Setting benchmarks for individuals based on a species norm, rather than on their actual capacities and preferences, may simply set them up for frustration and failure. Their unique individuality might include capacities and inclinations that are better realized in the company of animals, and if so, their flourishing might be stunted by rigid adherence to a species norm rather than a more species ecumenical conception of community. We cannot speak to Arthur's situation, but it seems possible that individuals with severe human social inhibitions or incapacities might flourish with alternatives to so-called normal levels of human contact. Someone like Arthur might find intellectual challenge and satisfaction through interaction with computers, with highly intelligent humans who understand and make allowances for his conditions, or with others who share his lack of social human functioning. Some of his emotional needs might be satisfied through friendships with dogs or pigs or other animals who have limited social expectations, but abundant capacity for love and attachment. Why isn't this a valid conception of individual human flourishing? Why should concepts such as community, sociality, friendship, and love be hedged by species? Throughout history, countless humans have chosen animals over human company, just as today many humans prefer to live with animal companions instead of human partners, children, or housemates. To pathologize these preferences as deviating from an alleged human norm is to close ourselves off from the potential richness of interspecies sociality. Indeed, research on human children highlights how they naturally see themselves as part of a shared society with animals. They have to be socialized into making a sharp separation between humans and other animals, and marking the boundaries of a strictly human society. There is no reason why we must mark the boundaries of society in this way. Nussbaum's focus on the species norm eclipses both ties across species and diversity within species. Consider the case of an infant chimpanzee, orphaned and injured in the wild, who is adopted by humans, and who is unlikely, due to injuries and socialization, to be able to return to life as a wild chimpanzee. The appropriate conception of flourishing for this animal is not a capability list for chimpanzees qua species. It is a capability list for this particular individual chimpanzee, who will be making his life primarily in human society. For him, learning rudimentary human language and various other aspects of human culture, far from being a frill, might be essential to flourishing, to being able to function and thrive in his environment. We are not just members of a species, we are members of societies, and the two don't necessarily overlap. A theory of justice needs to take account of our social context, not just our species membership. Similarly, differences from the norm are not necessarily disabilities in which the appropriate remedy is to try and replicate the norm. Individual variation can also lead to simply different or even superior abilities. Why shouldn't justice attend to these unique capacities rather than straitjacketing individuals according to a species norm? This indeed has been a familiar critique of Nussbaum's approach within the field of disability studies. As Silvers and Francis put it, quote, "On her capabilities approach, just treatment of the disabled seems to mean permitting, encouraging, or obliging the non-disabled to relate to the disabled primarily by improving them, whether or not they can be improved or whether or not they prefer to be improved." End quote. For both humans and animals, justice requires a conception of flourishing that is more sensitive to both interspecies community membership and intra-species individual variation. It should also be open to evolution as new forms of interspecies community emerge, opening up new possibilities for forms of animal and human flourishing. As we argue in Chapter 5, this is precisely what is offered by a citizenship model. Section 6. Conclusion. The limitations of current animal rights theory approaches. The abolitionist, threshold, and species norm approaches we have canvassed differ in many respects. Whereas abolitionists seek the extinction of domesticated animals, threshold and species norm approaches accept that human-animal contact is inevitable and sometimes desirable. However, at another level, they share some important assumptions. For all, domesticated animal status is conceived as a kind of deviation from their true or natural community in the wild, which remains the default position for thinking about our moral obligations. And this in turn is related to the assumption, shared by both abolitionists and threshold approaches, that domesticated animals are objects of human action and decision-making, never agents. Both assume that in human-animal communities, humans will inevitably, quote, call the shots, end quote, and typically go on to provide a list of practices that are deemed acceptable rather than exploitative, without seeking to solicit the preferences of individual animals themselves. In our view, we need an entirely new starting point. We need to start from the premise that humans and domesticated animals already form a shared community. We have brought domesticated animals into our society, and we owe them membership in it. This is their home now, where they belong, and their interests must be included in our conception of the common good of the community. And this in turn requires enabling animals to shape the evolution of our shared society, contributing to decisions about how their and our lives should go. We need to attend to what sorts of relationships animals themselves want to have with us and with each other, which are likely to develop over time, and to vary from individual to individual. The results are different to predict, and they are almost certainly going to be different from the sort of life animals would have led in the wild, and from what is entailed by a static notion of a species norm. In short, we need to recognize that domesticated animals are co-citizens of the community.